truly in the bottom corner, so the sound wasn't playing. So this is Bob Dylan talking World War III blues, live in England, 1965. And it's a very good introduction to the title of this talk, which is the need for a major debate on global governance, inoculation against elite in-group bias. This is a link to the blog, which I've just done on that topic. So anyway, without further ado, here's Bob Dylan.
One time a crazy dream came to me. I dreamt I was walking World War III. I went to the doctor the very next day to see what kind of things he had to say. He said it was a terrible dream. I said a whole doc of World War passed through my brain. He said, "Nurse, get your pad. The boy's obviously insane." He grabbed my arm and I said, "Ouch," as I landed on the psychiatric couch. He said, "Tell me all about it." Well, the whole thing started at 3 o'clock fast. It was all over by 1:15. I was down in the sewer with some little lover when I peeked out from a manhole cover, wondering who turned the lights on. Well, I got up and I walked around, up and down the lonesome town, just wondering which way to go. I lit a cigarette on a parking meter and walked on down the road. It was a normal day. Down the corner by the hot dog stand, I saw a man. I said, "Howdy, friend, I guess it's just us two." He screamed. Down the road he flew. He thought I was a communist. Well, I remember reading some newspaper ads, so I turned on the Conrad. I bet it didn't pay the Con Ed bill, so the radio didn't work so well. I turned on the record player. It was Donovan. Whoever Donovan is. I spied a girl before she could leave. I say, "Let's go play Adam and Eve." I take her by the heart and my hand was thumping. She said, "Hey man, are you crazy or something?" You saw what happened last time they started. By that time I was feeling blue and needed somebody to talk to. So I called up the operator of time just to hear a voice of some kind. She said, "When you hear the beep, it will be 3 o'clock. She said that for a couple days and then I hung up. Well, the doctor interrupted me just about then, saying, "I've been having the same old dream, but mine's different, don't you see? I dreamt the only person left after the war was me. I didn't see no one that looked like you around." Time passed and now it seems everybody's having those dreams. Everybody sees itself walking around with nobody else. Well, half the people can be all right part of the time. All of the people can be part right some of the time. Some of the people can be half right all of the time. But all of the people can't be all right all of the time. Robert Frost said that. I'll let you be in my dream if I can be in your dream. I said that.
All of the people can't be all right all the time. Bob Dylan and talking World War III blues there. So, the need for a major debate on global governance, inoculation against elite in-group bias, of course, all against the backdrop of a new threat of nuclear Armageddon. So, of course, that recording of Bob Dylan there in London in 1965, 2 years before there'd been the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I don't want to really go into all of that stuff. This is a more of a general kind of an overview and setting out what I see as the two competing factions now in the global oligarchy and their worldviews set against each other. And on the one side, you have what many describe as the money power. So this is global finance capital and seeking to control the world economy through monetary means. And then on the other side, set against them are the internationalists. And the internationalists have a worldview which is not altogether dissimilar to the money power, except it's more regionalized. It feels that at the national level, basically there are more chiefs than Indians, whereas the global money power version of events has one chief, first money equals, I suppose. I mean, there's not, in my view, there's not much between either of them in that neither of them are particularly bothered about what the hoi polloi think. So anyway, this blog is opened with this graphic off the World Economic Forum website, and there's a general topic of global governance, and one of the tabs around the outside of that is vaccination. And of course, vaccination and with the 2 years that we've just been through with the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 pandemic response, vaccination is clearly something which the World Economic Forum consider to be of some importance. It's a bit small here, but I'll just read it. This is a claim for vaccines, which the World Economic Forum make. In the past few decades, morbidity and mortality attributable to vaccine-preventable disease, such as measles, mumps, and polio, have dramatically declined as immunization coverage increased, especially in countries with routine vaccination programs. However, global vaccine uptake has stagnated as misinformation and anti-vaccination propaganda have spread. Now, amid efforts to vaccinate populations against COVID-19 as swiftly as possible, technology giants are under pressure to remove harmful associated distortions and inaccuracies from their platforms. The transformation map is informed by the views of a wide range of experts from the World Economic Forum Expert Network and is curated in partnership with Heidi Larson, founding director of Vaccine Confidence Project and professor of anthropology, risk and decision science at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Special thanks to Gavi, IFPMA and the Red Cross for their contributions. Now, we could have a whole discussion about how slanted, misinformed, preloaded with assumptions that paragraph is. I mean, it's a particular view, and it's really very typical of these sorts of elitist pseudo academic. Really, they're cheerleaders, they're polemics for a particular view rather than a reasoned, balanced scientific debate, as it were. And it kind of just sets off a kind of a sort of a repulsion. It's a repulsive sort of arrogance, which certain personality types, of which I'm one, just don't respond to that sort of do as we say, not as we do-ism, as it were. So anyway, that's that. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, I put this video together, and it's the Killing Joke track, I Am the Virus. And I'm surprised it hasn't become absolutely world famous. Obviously, it's something which the major platforms are, to quote here, technology giants are under pressure to remove harmful associated distortions, inaccuracies from their platforms. I guess it falls under that sort of peer pressure in the global oligarchy. So anyway, let's just play it now. I should just say that I've cut into it the beginning of the Odyssey and some footage of Boris Johnson quoting that. It's one of his party pieces. And the translation comes up as it goes along. But I'm going to play it now, and this is about 10 minutes long.
Diacetalea tabule, exudata prota, diastatain erasante, atreades, kewanax andron, kai dios, Achilleus. Memories of real tears, calculated waves of fear, drawn up by things past, there's a darkness in the west. Oh, you're swelling. Governing corporates, central banking, Hogar Badilei Colosis, Lutonana, on Osticatain, on a Compodelai, Unecaton to Fame, at the Martin Maritera. I am the fire.
The impact of not doing something has lots of consequences. We can't retreat from the rest of the world.
Continuity of government here cannot be overestimated.
Federal quarantine of this scale is unprecedented.
Something's gone horribly wrong. Our population in deep denial. Contagion release.
It began in healthy-looking pigs months, perhaps years ago.
A new coronavirus spread silently within herds.
So I'm the spirit of outrage, the worm you can never delete. Obviously, this blog links in the description, so you can look at that in your own time. That's actually embedded from a BitChute rendition. I don't think it survived on my YouTube channel. So here we go. The need for a major debate on global governance. A deliberate and symmetrical plan of slavery. Single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day, but a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers to plainly prove a deliberate, systemical plan of reducing us to slavery. Thomas Jefferson, August 1774. So this is an introduction to a voluminous work setting out the background to what's really mapped in the World Economic Forum app, which linked to above with the vaccination thing, which we'll get to again in a moment as well. And it's by a chap called Lawrence Chadwick. Anyway, here's his introduction. The purpose of this volume is to present an overview of the world management system currently in place and the global community that is emerging along with its future goals and plans in order to stimulate debate concerning its development and implementation. It contains a series of essays and interviews written and conducted over a period of 18 years. And it was published in 2007. So that was just prior to the 2008 global financial crisis. Of course, we've had another one, or in the midst of another one, which started in September 2019 in what's known as the New York repo rate spike, which brought in something known as Going Direct, which is a Blackstone report prepared for the Federal Reserve and the US Federal Treasury with respect to the sort of financial engineering that would need to go on to get out of the next crisis. And this has all gone along in parallel with the pandemic. So the more cynical view or the skeptical view of the response to the SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 novel coronavirus, that response has gone way beyond a public health response and in lockstep, as it were, with the Going Direct recommendations of BlackRock to the Federal Reserve. So, in order to gain a clearer picture of the emerging global community, we will need to traverse the subjects of international finance, international trade, international relations, international organizations, nation-state governance, central banking policies, international educational policies, the world of the large tax-exempt foundations, politics, economics, science, philosophy, social engineering, and much more. It is an exciting and highly rewarding adventure. However, the reader may encounter information which will challenge his former worldviews. Famous aphorism, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. So I did a reading of the introduction to this previously, which is on my YouTube channel, and this was in, let's just get the date here. Good afternoon. I'm going to do a reading of this. So I did this on the 18th of January 2022. So here we are. That's at the beginning of 2022, and here we are in March, midway through March 2022. And a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since then, we could say. So that's there. And then here is the embedded full work by Michael Lawrence Chadwick, Global Governance in the 21st Century, an overview of the elite forces controlling the world economy. And so that's, it is a huge document. It's a very good reference point. And if certain things crop up and you know, you want to get a bit of background on them, it's always worth referring back to this one collection of documentation showing the evolution of these matters. I was reading part of it, actually a paper published in 1980 today, where they were talking about using less oil and using more coal. I mean, clearly the dangers of carbon and climate change weren't in the forefront of policymakers' armory for you know, progressing things back then, as obviously they clearly still are now. And then this is a talk by Michael Kaufman, and this is actually a part of a segment of this is in the Alex Jones film Endgame, and Is a Carbon Currency the End Game was the title of this talk, and it's well worth seeking out, having a look at. This is the first sort of 10 minutes of the talk, which I put on BitChute, so the various links or whatever. So if you click on the titles there, you see the BitChute video will come up, and then below that in the description you can see that then links to another blog, and you can get links and what have you to there. This is a link to a now defunct Yumpu channel I had, which isn't on the Wayback Machine either, but I digress. So here we are. So this is the World Economic Forum's global governance perspective. Now, it's an interesting question. Are the World Economic Forum a voice of the money power, or a voice of the internationalist, I guess you'd say Trotskyist front, as it were? And that's an interesting question. I think part of my analysis of this is founded in a wishful thinking that there is some faction in the oligarchy pushing back against some of the more extreme subtexts to things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, to which I'm talking about the eugenics and population control and population culling, extreme views expressed by people like David Attenborough, or Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson's father particularly. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that question for now, just to be aware that the global governance ambitions of the World Economic Forum are certainly coming from a substantial part of the financial oligarchy and the corporate industrial oligarchy, and also seems to have a lot of people in positions as bragged about by Klaus Schwab. So anyway, so global governance, this is what the in its own words, this is the World Economic Forum's own words. So global governance is a means to manage issues that cut across national borders, whether it is a pandemic, a financial crisis, climate change, or a geo-economic dispute. Though traditionally centred on diplomacy and international organisations, a wide variety of public and private actors now engage in cross-border governance. The work itself has expanded well beyond treaty making to include formal and informal monitoring, standard setting, enforcement, and financing. Effective governance is essential to secure peaceful, healthy, and prosperous societies, particularly now amid COVID-19 worsening ecological crises, mounting geopolitical tension, and growing nationalist backlash against globalization. Again, this is a rhetorical technique known as poisoning the well, or setting up a straw man even as well. And this is typical of my reaction to so much of this spun content is, well, hold on a second, you know, if that's you laying out the state of the art, or the state of play trying to be balanced, in no universe is that a balanced way of setting up a discussion. This is a fait accompli being presented as, you know, the famous other actor in Tina, there is no alternative. So the next heading, though, goes on to deepening transnational links are being used for geopolitical leverage. This is called weaponizing interdependence, is the tag in the you can see here, weaponizing interdependence, and then up here, this is what it says about that. So let's just read what they say next. So once distant people and places are increasingly being tied together by globalization. This involves not only the creation of economic links through cross-border trade and investment, but also stronger social bonds, increased communication, and heightened shared vulnerabilities to pandemics and environmental degradation. COVID-19 has vividly highlighted the challenges involved in managing this new, deeper level of global interdependence, as the World Health Organization seeks to keep everyone informed about the crises and aligned on ways to combat it, despite persistent criticism. As globalization has advanced, the ability to guarantee peace and prosperity for any given society is increasingly affected by decisions made elsewhere. The creation and distribution of problematic mortgages in the US can lead to workers in Iceland losing their jobs, for example, while interaction with infected wildlife in one part of the world can devastate the health of people on every continent. Meanwhile, carbon emissions that occur in any single place can affect the future of the climate everywhere. Managing this interdependence is the central task of global governance, and that task is only getting harder. After World War II, global governance became increasingly robust. It created the necessary conditions for globalization. When businesses branched out into foreign markets, they developed multinational models and value chains that increased their need to support effective governance wherever they operated. That in turn enabled other businesses to become more globally distributed, resulting in a self-reinforcing interdependence. However, as prosperity and well-being in one place now depend on decisions made abroad to a greater extent than ever before, geopolitical competition is now increasingly leading to the weaponization of interdependence, with countries using economic ties as leverage. For example, technologies like 5G and semiconductors have become geopolitical footballs between China and the US and the European Union has leveraged its market heft to promulgate global data privacy standards, while COVID-19 has underlined supply chain risk and led to some efforts to decouple ties between the US and China. Interdependence is unlikely to disappear. In some areas, it may be deepening. Making that interdependence effective is now more important than ever for tackling shared challenges and ensuring prosperity. This is almost the madness of globalization. And it goes beyond a reasonable expectation of benefits from specialization or monoculture. When on the face of it, one reads that and thinks, oh, these people, they're being very reasonable. It really is nothing of the sort. I mean, the European Union is painted as with the moral high ground there against the awful China and US competitiveness, as it were. But it's disingenuous. And again, there are a number of assumptions taken for granted that are actually taken as read, such as carbon emissions being harmful, the problematic mortgages in the US leading to workers in Iceland losing their jobs and stuff like that. Now, a lot of these references, they don't go to the root causes of these individual problems, but what they do is they lump in an overall conclusion based on things that simply aren't correlated or simply are unrelated. And again, it's this is a presentation which is it's just dishonest. I mean, I'm trying to be charitable here. I'm trying myself not to poison the well. But for something which masquerades as being intellectually rigorous, it's nothing of the sort. So anyway, weaponizing interdependence. What does it mean? I'm always left speechless when I go on to the site. It's so outrageously beyond the pale that it's almost impossible to get back on track. It really is appalling. Anyway, well, let's just crack on. This is a very good site called the Technocratic Tyranny, which is traces in much the same way as the Chadwick paper, probably in a more accessible way, more interactive way, if you like. And again, it's well worth having a look at these things. Really, more or less, to provide yourself some balance as you work through what the WEF has actually got to say for itself. So then the next tag is the transnational actors, and This is what they've got to say about that. A wider range of actors is engaging in global governance, though not all are benign. International relations is not only about developing direct relationships between national governments. While sovereign countries remain central actors on the world's political stage, a host of non-state and transnational actors have progressively inserted themselves into discussions about global governance. Digitalization has reduced communication costs to the point that businesses, for example, can more easily organize themselves globally and publicly address global issues and concerns. And even relatively small civil society groups can connect across borders in order to tackle issues with an international scope. It has become increasingly clear that problems like pandemics, the catastrophic impacts of climate change, heavy flows of migration as refugees flee from armed conflict and economic hardship, a lack of adequate healthcare in both developed and less developed regions, and the depletion of natural resources cannot be adequately addressed solely within national borders, giving actors previously concerned only with local issues a greater incentive to engage with global governance. In addition to corporations and non-governmental organisations, these transnational actors have included city governments, philanthropic organisations, and trade associations. So here we see their big obsessions. So it becomes increasingly clear that problems like, okay, so in the first case, are they problems? What are the causes of those problems? Is this and is the answer to these problems that may or may not exist in the form which can be approached through this idea that you need global governance or overarching global governance? What's wrong with good old-fashioned cooperation, as it were? It's hard going, this stuff, because it is authoritarian. That's the thing it's shot through with. It's shot through with authoritarianism and coercion, and that's taken as given that might is right. That big is beautiful, or etc. And then lip service is paid to the perfectly valid models that are put forward for dealing with problems that do exist, whether they're temporary problems or permanent problems or problems that could get worse. The idea of divergent and convergent problems, for instance. How do you deal with the non-linearities in converging problems? Does global governance really give you the tools to do that? In my view, to that is no, because you need subsidiarity and autonomy to act at local levels, because the world is not one big whole that gives birth to the small. It's the small give birth to the whole, which is a point which Michael Kaufman makes in his talk when he talks about the United States Constitution and how the states created the federal government to serve the states. The federal government did not create the states to serve the federal government. And so this massively centralized, top-down, it's effectively saying the tail must always wag the dog. And so again, that's when you get to the elitism, sitting in judgment on everybody else, saying, what do you do? Well, you're a useless eater. When the obvious question is, well, who are you? And how do you say you're not a useless eater? Who put you in that position to tell me what is and isn't beneficial to my community or to my family? In classical antiquity, this is and Schumpeter has talked about the ephors of death, and the ephors were the committee that oversaw the Spartan kings. Sparta had 2 kings, and the ephors sort of above them. So these are self-appointed ephors, and they are answerable to no one. How does that work? It's well, I mean, frankly, it doesn't work, and their intellectual skill sets are now so heavily degraded that they cannot see the wood for the trees, and they're so discombobulated by their own bullshit. They cannot ever accept that they are the cause of many of the problems, which in many respects are figments of their own imagination and their own paranoia. So anyway, here we go. Let's move on here. So some have become extraordinarily influential, such as the Gates Foundation, thanks to its work on solving global health problems, or the C40 network of cities, due to its work related to addressing climate change. Meanwhile, multinational corporations often boast financial resources larger than the size of many countries' GDPs, and large NGOs often have more delegates at international meetings than some medium-sized nations. As the capability of these actors sometimes outweighs that of nation states, it lends them decisive roles in resolving global issues. Their contributions do not necessarily come at the expense of government influence, but they have fundamentally reshaped notions about who matters in world politics. Damn right they have. Increasingly, though, transnational actors also include dangerous entities like organized crime syndicates, terrorist networks, and paramilitary organizations. In some ways, you can read this as a kind of an absurdist satire of themselves. Of course, they take themselves far too seriously for that sort of introspection. But organized crime syndicates, terrorist networks, and paramilitary organizations, they could be talking about themselves. You know, crime syndicates is the word. WEF itself could be painted as a crime syndicate. Terrorist networks, let's talk about Project Gladio, shall we, and the Stay Behind networks, etc., which are they're fully and utterly exposed in court documents from Italy. And Daniel Ganser, is a Swiss professor, has published extensive research on Project Gladio. And then paramilitary organizations. Well, how about the White Helmets? We can kick off with that one. And, well, you know, state-funded paramilitary organizations, I think you'll find that many of these supposedly respectable delegates at the WEF are up to their eyes in such clandestine organizations. And clandestine cross-border networks that can be difficult to track and confront, particularly in those parts of the world with fragile or corrupt state organizations. These transnational entities can exploit weak governance and evade law enforcement. I'm sorry, it's hard to take this seriously. So that's transnational actors. I mean, that can be summed up by the whole one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, or indeed one man's oligarch is another man's philanthropist, it would seem. So the architecture of global governance is becoming increasingly diverse. Really? Traditionally, global governance has been centered on interstate diplomacy and formal intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations. the World Bank, or the World Health Organization. But as the interdependence of nations and regions has deepened, an array of sometimes competing institutions has emerged as important players in world politics. While the World Trade Organization remains at the center of the global trade regime, for example, the proliferation of preferential trade agreements since the end of the Cold War has given countries alternative means of securing economic cooperation. Similarly, the rise of liquidity swap lines and other arrangements between central banks has called the International Monetary Fund's traditional position as the global leader of last resort into question. While state-centric formal institutions remain critical, companies, non-governmental organizations, and other private actors now often set regulatory standards, arbitrate disputes, and otherwise help govern the global economy. In addition, networks of domestic government officials, mayors, legislators, judges, and regulators regularly collaborate with their peers across borders, providing a new take on traditional diplomacy. Okay, and you expect that to get a ringing endorsement? How's that working out? It is mind-blowing. It is mind-blowing how unself-aware this organization is and how it presents itself here with its public-facing material. One supposes that the WF is trying to show its best face here, and it's risible. Increasingly, both individual states and international organizations have sought to advance their respective goals, not only through diplomacy and treaty making, but also by orchestrating partnerships between public entities and private businesses that are designed to pursue shared goals. While this trend towards public-private partnerships is now widespread, however, it has not been evenly distributed. In some realms, like decision and policy making related to addressing and adapting to the disastrous impacts of climate change, there it is again, or global health issues, there it is again, including devastating pandemics, there it is again. Governance has become highly diversified among a broader mix of entities. Meanwhile, other areas such as traditional security issues remain firmly within the remits of central governments. The proliferation of institutions that are engaged in global governments has led to a not infrequent overlap of public and private entities tackling similar issues. Sometimes this leads to a fragmentation that limits the overall effectiveness of global governance. In other cases, however, it involves the creation of entirely new forms of institutions, a more innovative and adaptable global governance, and ultimately more effective problem solving. Really, more effective problem solving? You think so? So there we are. Increasingly diverse institutional complexity. So multipolarity has upended traditional power structures and opened the door to new geopolitical conflicts. So this is power shifts and conflict. The realignment of economic power creates new pathways to conflict. As globalization has spurred higher growth around the world, new countries have emerged as major powers in world politics. This marks an extraordinary advance in terms of human development, as hundreds of millions of people escape poverty and join the middle class. At the same time, however, the economic rise of Brazil, China, India, and other emerging markets has upended the traditional power balance, along with traditional structures of global governance. Whereas in the past, a few large industrialized countries could set the rules of the global economy, today a much broader consensus among nations is required. Just to interject here, there's been some comment recently about what they call the golden billion. This is a first among equals approach to governance. And I mean, it's quite condescending. I mean, well, elitism is, I mean, by definition, it's going to be condescending to those who are not considered to be elite. And again, these are the sorts of issues which have contributed massively to what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment, but also those same matters can be found in Syria, in Libya, in Egypt, and elsewhere in the world. And I've got to say, I mean, I don't find any authenticity or genuine empathy with ends which I could sign up for with these people. I think it is wrapped up in state worship and corporate worship, if you will. And the worst parts of nationalism, which these people are quick to criticize, are my country, right or wrong. And with these people, it seems to be my financial system, right or wrong, my global financial monopoly, right or wrong. It doesn't seem to occur for a second that they may actually be wrong about any of this, let alone that they could be more wrong than right. Going back to Bob Dylan at the beginning of this, you know, all the people can't be right all of the time. Anyway, let's plow on. As a critical venue for international economic coordination and in the emergence of greater numbers of institutional investors from emerging markets who now wield global influence, such as the Beijing-based Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which began operations in 2016. Most vividly, economic shifts have raised the stakes in the geopolitical competition between the US and China, which sends repercussions through the economic system. Right. Okay. Just as an aside there, one of the things I've been thinking about over the last week or two is Anthony Miguel's on the Real Currencies blog I linked to the other day, where he said that the US empire is not the money power. So this idea of empires and imperialism centered around the national state side of things is not the same as the global money power. And this is perhaps a clue that perhaps the WF is plugged into the global money power, or certainly a faction within the global money power. The question is, this is a question which Anthony goes into, is whether or not President Putin, President Xi, and some of these other globalist figures are on the side of the money power or the side of the globalist internationalist power, and how that works. And it's quite a difficult question, and it's a question which I've been wrestling with for several weeks now. But I read that paragraph there, which suggests that question is really quite important at the moment in terms of where all this ends up. This next insert here in the blog, the reason this is here, it's a wonderful German documentary about the World Health Organization called Trust Who. It was released pre-pandemic, and it shows the extent of the influence that both Gavi and the Gates Foundation have in this organization, and it's well worth looking at. And bear in mind the pot calling the kettle black, just in this other previous paragraph here, which I did highlight, and that is the point here. Just here again, such organizations have benefited from globalization, digitalization, and have developed sophisticated communication and clandestine cross-border networks that can be difficult to track and confront. So this is the idea of the bad actors. And bad actors for these people are simply people they don't agree with. Again, back to the idea of demonizing any opposition, which is something that Michael Kaufman makes in the talk earlier. So power shifts and conflict. So nationalist backlash has made effective global governments more difficult and more necessary. Excuse me? I mean, does that really move one to the other? Is that a logical next step? But because there's a backlash against global governments and what they call effective global governments, and because of that backlash, it's even more necessary that that's called doubling down. That's called, when you're in a hole, stop digging, in some people's view of the world, but clearly not the world of the World Economic Forum, self-appointed E4s. So the widespread resurgence of nationalist and populist politics has raised serious questions about the future viability of global governance. This troubling trend is, at least in part, a result of backlash against globalization, against both the economic and social dislocations it has genuinely created, and those for which it is unfairly blamed. Populist movements generally express skepticism of perceived elites and profess a faith in the wisdom of ordinary people. Yet they also tend to have an authoritarian bent, really, and a belief in a strong leader able to mobilize the masses. Examples of successful populist movements include former US President Donald Trump's 2016 election campaign, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's consolidation of political authority in Turkey. Such movements typically appeal to those. They've stopped mentioning Brexit here, obviously. Maybe they don't think Brexit has actually happened, and it is a moot question whether or not it will ever happen with Boris Johnson at the supposedly at the helm, as it were. Anyway, such movements typically appeal to those particularly worried about threats to their social status due to their actual or feared loss of a job, or to those troubled by immigration and changing cultural mores. In other words, people who feel especially vulnerable to exactly the kinds of changes unleashed by globalization. In a number of countries, governments have simply failed to understand or address the true impacts of globalization on their constituencies. It's risible, this stuff. So this is Naomi Wolf being interviewed on one of the mainstream US channels, I think it's Fox News, saying that it's not a vaccine passport, it's actually a digital ID card, and on which she's absolutely right. And again, that much of these self-deluding presentations by the World Economic Forum, I think there's a large part that they actually believe their own bullshit. They don't subject themselves to the sort of scrutiny or even psychoanalysis that they're more than happy to subject those that oppose them to. So even if countries have benefited from greater economic openness, a lack of sufficient attention paid to those left behind can weaken the political consensus supporting that openness. Anti-globalization movements tend to oppose not only the aims of global governments, which they believe are rooted in a fictitious cosmopolitan unity of human interests, but also institutions they believe are biased in favor of other countries or a rootless elite. These movements are at least partly a reaction to real failures to effectively function, for example, during the 2008 financial crisis. Some might add the global COVID-19 response to this list, especially the WF. If people turn against global governance, however, it can exacerbate the very problems nationalist populist movements aim to solve, as nationalist politics generally push governments away from global cooperation and effective coordination. That in turn risks triggering a downward spiral of mismanagement. For example, nationalist leaders actively undercut the ability of the World Health Organization to respond to COVID-19 by limiting its funding and decision-making authority, or while blaming global institutions for not doing more to halt the disease and deflecting attention from their own response efforts or lack thereof at home. I'm sorry, it's risible. It really is. It's beneath contempt. This is a compilation of trailers for films in which Andrew Niccol has been involved, which look at the dystopian side of these might is right worldview belief systems. So then we come to anti-globalism and what they've got to say about anti-globalism. That's what this paragraph here was about, was the anti-globalism and the so-called nationalist backlash. In some aspects, this is a class war thing, and so I think Warren Buffett's been quoted, and possibly damn right, there's a class war and we're winning it. And a good example of that sort of thing recently was P&O calling all of their ferries back and sacking 800 staff over a Zoom link or whatever, and they're coming into rightful criticism, I think, by elements in the British government at the moment. But it really is one rule for them and another for everybody else. The idea of socialism for the rich and capitalism for everybody else is very real in all of this. And so then I've got some links to, this is the blog I did with the original talk about the Michael L. Chadwick tome. And then this is a blog I did the other day about Walden 2, which is the behaviorist B.F. Skinner's novel on a utopian community based along scientific lines, as it were. Well worth reading that. And then go on to look at questions about the end of the petrodollar, carbon currency endgame, etc. And another thing which I've been looking at, this speaks to the idea of the shift in power to those with the hydrocarbon resources and those with the control of the financial system. And I think that the renewable energy, particularly carbon trading aspects, as they're related to money creation, have a very real effect on the availability of debt-based money to buy hydrocarbons, and effectively the renewable energy producers are becoming the swing producers of energy, affecting energy market prices in the same way that Saudi used to be a swing producer, or the Texas Rail Commission in the 1930s were a swing producer for US oil. which is a way of actually monopolists controlling prices in a marketplace. And so what we see here is a system setting out its stall or setting up its levers of control to perpetuate itself, even though it is in and of itself redundant in a modern digital age. And so effectively everything that the WF and a centralized control monopoly system is doing to perpetuate itself is harmful to the potentiality of the system which it is trying to maintain its tyrannical control over. And that's the problem. Well, that's the paradigm shift that we're actually facing here. It's a paradigm shift away from these top-down control models. Walden 2 kind of touches on that as a behavioral psychological adjustment that needs to take place, but the main psychological adjustment that's required, because the way I always explain this is that people like Klaus Schwab or people out of that ilk, these control freak types, never learned to share nicely at school, you know. So whereas the rest of us, or many people, got used to that idea. Oh well, we'll share, we'll play nicely, as it were. But those that have got away with preferential treatment, etc., so those born with a silver spoon in their mouth, that sort of thing, aren't any good at sharing, and they want people to kind of be paying tribute, as it were. And the psychological adjustment in the modern world is for those people to actually unlearn their antisocial behaviors. And they're at the top of the pile. By and large, you know, for most of the people you care to meet in the world, you know, they're down with things being fairer. So it's a peculiar one, but because the definition of terms as set out on the WF site and all the rest of it, they are defining problems as straw men, which they set about solving, but the straw men they set up aren't actually in existence, or the causes of the problems that they describe are such that if you understood the causes, you would describe the problem rather differently. And so they have solutions looking for problems. That's what the WEF and world government is, a solution that suits an elite group of people looking for a problem. And if the problem doesn't exist, then they will invent it and continue to invent it. And that's what we're confronted here with. The people who are redundant, the useless eaters, are frankly the billionaires and the class of people surrounding that body of billionaires. If the billionaires cease to exist tomorrow, the rest of us would be absolutely fine. That's the truth of the matter. And the mistake that people make is that the more generalized skills that most of us have some of are less replaceable in the short term than the goal-hanging glory hunters. Yet the models are set up that we think we can't do without those people, and that's the big that is the glaring truth which people like the WF, they want to hide. They want to hide their own inadequacy their own inability to act as they do. I mean, they are the scary monster under the bed, and they rely on scary monsters under the bed to maintain their powers of control over us. That's my view, and nothing I've read on the WF site dissuades me of that. So anyway, the link is there to all of that WF stuff. I think you have to sign up to the site, and then you get updates and stuff. So I signed up and I've looked at all their thing, and I do read the updates. I read Project Syndicate as well, and other publications that they put out. One has to hold one's nose and give them, due regard. So, and then I move on, and anyway, this is I've told this, the isms of globalism and the money power deities in the Chadwick introduction, which is linked above. There's a chapter of the philosophical foundations of global governance. In order to guide the nations and people of the world into a state of global governance, it was necessary for the elites in New York, London, Paris, Frankfurt, Tokyo to support a set of political, economic, social, and religious philosophies that would advance their long-term objectives. These philosophies included, and then there's a very long list, and you can, look up what all of those things are. Just stick that search as a search term and read the Wikipedia article on all of them. These philosophies pave the way for economic, political, financial, social power to be centralized in the hands of a few carefully selected individuals and elite financial planners. So then a global banking system. So in order to facilitate the development of a unified banking system throughout the world in private hands, it was felt desirable to establish a central bank system in each nation. Today, there exists in every nation a central bank, which is controlled by private individuals. In the United States, the central bank is known as the Federal Reserve System. The Bank of International Settlements in Basel serves as the coordinating center for this global network. Once a month, the leading central bankers from the advanced world meet at Basel to develop joint strategies and programs. The elite planners are hopeful that the IMF and the BIS can be successfully transformed into a world central bank. It would, in essence, be a Federal Reserve System on a global scale. The new World Central Bank would be able to create, control, and eliminate international liquidity. It would also control the activities of all national central banks and act as a lender of last resort to rescue the elite financial oligarchy when their plans fail or they encounter difficulty in various nations, such as occurred in 94 and 95 in Mexico. So then this is a compilation I did of at the beginning of the pandemic. This is in I think it was January or February 2020, Ursula von der Leyen, who was then the newly elected president of the EU Commission, talking, I think, at the World Economic Forum, and it's like a eulogy to Klaus Schwab. And then I've cut into that various other sort of relevant stuff, including things from Dr. Strangelove, etc. And then these are the Damon Rabel films, Renaissance to the Financial Empire and Debunking Money, the Way the World Really Works, and a number of concepts in both of those videos do refer back to Machiavellianism, for instance. So that was that. And then this excellent film is Monopoly, which is an hour well worth spending. It features Blackstone rather a lot. We mentioned the Going Direct report that was published in the autumn or summer of 2019, which seems to be the blueprint of the response to the pandemic, as it were. Then here's technocratic tyranny, which gives some of the background to some of these policies implemented under the headings of the scary monsters, which featured extensively in the WF World Governance thing. Then this takes me back. Sue Cipriano used to have an excellent talk radio show first in California and then in Portland in Oregon. Sadly, Sue died in 2015, but this has links to her interview with Richard Moore, who wrote Escaping the Matrix. And Richard Moore has a wonderful website, and his websites go back to the mid-90s, which are quite early, and so you get a good feeling of what's been going on the last 27, more or less the last 30 years. Stat Kapitalet, this famous Swedish punk song, and this is Luke Wright's Once You Bury the Bodies, his poem for Bojo. I'm just going to play out this with Luke's poem.
Come now, native, wipe that tear. All's not lost. This time next year, we'll build a shopping centre here. Well, once you clear the bodies, bring on the low tax Costa Blanco. Bojo's on it. Chin up, Sambo. What you want's a brand new Nando's. Once you clear the bodies, that's it. Swap that spear for Lucra. Get some aircon. Splendid, super, Apple, Gucci, Ray-Ban, Uber. Once you clear the bodies. I feel for you. Hey, I've read Brooke. War's a horrid thing. Now, look, it's British Airways. Thomas Cook. Once you clear the bodies, so grab a broom. Yes, quickly, please. We'll bring old Blighty's expertise. No, me no speako bongoese. Just clear the bloody bodies. The friendly guns have done their bit. Shock doctrine strikes. Now, dig that pit. We'll build a massive mall right here, and you can work in it. Once you clear the bodies.
There's a group of UK business people actually, I don't know whether you come across them, wonderful guys who they've got a brilliant vision to turn CERT into the next, with the help of the municipality CERT, turn it into the next Dubai. The only thing they've got to do is clear the dead bodies.
Once you clear the
Come now,
bodies,
native, wipe that.
Once you clear the bodies, may give you some idea of where the skeletons are buried in this global dystopian nightmare that's being cooked up for us by these self-important, self-promoting, narcissistic, psychopathic, and that's just the good points of the Davos set.